Hi there, this is All 24 News live from Algiers. Coming up next in our news program. Omicron spread is turning the world upside down. New lockdown measures, mandatory vaccinations, introducing new treatments and banning flight. All of this only contain the new variant plus. Iran is providing two drafts to lift sanctions and nuclear obligations to European powers involved in the 2015 nuclear deal. Iran stated that the deal is within reach if the West shows good intentions. And finally, a meeting of U.S. State Secretary General and NATO top diplomats was held in the Latvian capital Riga. The meeting aimed to discuss Russian military deployments near Ukrainian borders, as the last considered it military escalation. The 8th High-Level Conference on Peace and Security in Africa kicked off today, Thursday, in the Algerian western province, Oran, after 3 editions held in the same city in 2013, 2014 and 2015. Nabil Khazini.
The 8th High-Level Conference on Peace and Security in Africa kicked off on Thursday in Oran after 3 editions held in the same city in 2013, 2014 and 2015.
And I must say that I'm all the most pleased to note that this high-level seminar, the first editions of which were hosted precisely a few years back here in this very city of Oran and in the same premises, has since been institutionalized as a regular forum for collective reflection, exchange of views, exchange of experiences, lessons learned, and best practices for the sake of enabling our representatives within the UN Security Council to represent us and to be able to demonstrate the true spirit of African unity and solidarity in promoting African common positions on peace and security matters.
The conference was attended by the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the National Community Abroad, Ramtan Lamamra, the Tunisian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Immigration and Tunisians Abroad, Othman El-Jarandi, the Chadian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Sherif Mohamed Zain, the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ethiopia, Demke Mekonnen Hassan, and the Minister of Foreign Relations of the Republic of Angola, Antonio Tite. Experts and high representatives of African organizations, the United Nations and the League of Arab States are also taking part in the 3-day conference. The conference is held under the title of assisting the new African members of the United Nations Security Council to prepare for addressing issues of peace and security on the African continent. The head of the Algerian diplomacy emphasized that this meeting reinforces and binds the African countries' relations in addition to strengthening ties with countries outside the continent for a better income.
The theme of this seminar, evolving around ensuring adequate support to the African members of the UN Security Council in dealing with African peace and security issues, is of obvious topical importance. It translates, indeed, our engagement to redouble efforts to make Africa's voice stronger at the international level, to ensure that its efforts are recognized and that its major concerns, strategic interests, and reasonable perspectives are duly taken into account.
It is worth mentioning that the proceedings of this conference is organized through sessions during which the participants will discuss many issues such as coordination to support the voice of Africa in the UN Security Council, engineering governance in Africa, and also the threat of terrorism on the African continent.
To COVID-19 updates now, the discovery of the Omicron variant has pushed the debate of mandatory vaccinations to the top of South Africa's agenda. Sid Islam reports.
According to the National Institute for Communicable Diseases, there has been an exponential increase in infections over the last 2 weeks, with a weekly average of about 300 new cases per day, climbing to 1,000 last week and 3,500 most recently. On Wednesday, South Africa recorded 8,561 cases. A week earlier, the daily figure was 1,275.
We thought, what will outcompete Delta? I think that's always been the question. What will outcompete Delta in terms of transmissibility, at least?
74% of all viral genomes sequenced last month were of the new variant, which was identified in a sample collected on November 8 in Gauteng, South Africa's most populous province. Experts are working against the clock to determine the level of the protection offered by existing immunizations.
In fact, and some of those admissions might have started before we think the emergence of Omicron, and we also seen that there was an increase in influenza cases in South Africa just in the last month or so. And so we need to really be careful to look at the other respiratory infections and other respiratory diseases.
Early epidemiological evidence revealed that Omicron was able to evade some protection, but modern immunization should still protect against severe illness and death. Limits were lifted earlier this month in the country, which has fully inoculated around 92% of the population. Infections have since escalated, and the discovery of Omicron has raised additional worries about the pressure on an already overcrowded healthcare system. Nonetheless, the WHO has constantly cautioned that as long as the coronavirus is allowed to move freely in large unprotected populations, it will continue to create new types.
And to know more about how the new variant Omicron is turning the world upside down, let's follow this special report by Zahra Farjani.
There is a growing number of cases being discovered with no travel connection to South Africa. This shows that the variant was in circulation in other countries before health authorities alerted the world of its presence. The European Commission President expressed concern over the new variant Omicron. She called on the EU nations to consider mandatory vaccination against the spread of the highly contagious variant. Chancellor Angela Merkel and her elected successor Olaf Scholz meet today, Thursday, German regional leaders to finalize the tightened COVID restrictions and measures requiring compulsory vaccination in the region. Regulators in the United Kingdom have approved the use of the monoclonal antibody GlaxoSmithKline to treat those at high risk of developing severe COVID-19 symptoms after claiming its safety and effectiveness at reducing the risk of hospitalization and death. In a plan against the spread of Omicron, Japan has introduced a new travel plan for foreigners as the Japanese Transport Ministry issued a request to the national airlines to stop taking any bookings for flights coming to Japan, at least for the current month of December. Two foreigners who had recently traveled from South Africa to India tested positive for the new Omicron variant. The government then introduced strict new rules for international travelers coming into the country.
A plane from the European border agency Frontex landed on the 1st of December in the French northern city Lille to be deployed over the English Channel and help fight migratory trafficking. This comes a week after the death of 27 migrants in the English Channel, the worst tragedy to be ever recorded in the Channel. Nabil Khazini.
The tragic drownings of 27 migrants on the English Channel has escalated tensions between the UK and France. The political spat on the migration issue between both countries started when Boris Johnson sent a public letter to Emmanuel Macron, who seemed not to be happy with Johnson's steps to resolve the problem. As a reaction, France rescinded the invite to UK Home Secretary Priti Patel after a row broke out late last week. Talks in the northern city of Calais started on Sunday to address the issue of human trafficking gangs. Immigration ministers from Germany, the Netherlands and Belgium, except for the United Kingdom, attended the meeting. France concluded talks and the French Interior Minister Gérald Darmanin said in a tweet that Frontex would deploy a plane to fly day and night over English Channel European coasts to monitor the shores of France, Belgium and the Netherlands for smuggling networks.
Announced last Wednesday, Frontex arrived in Lille today to strengthen air surveillance as part of the fight against illegal immigration in the Channel.
The number of migrants trying to cross the Channel in small boats has jumped this year, amid pandemic travel restrictions and after Britain's Brexit departure from the EU. However, the number of migrants arriving in Britain is low compared with other European countries.
The Mexican and U.S. international development agencies will work together on a project in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador aimed at alleviating the root causes of migration. The new framework for development cooperation to address the root causes of irregular migration from Northern Central America was called Planting Opportunities. The project will include additional agriculture and youth workforce development activities. Iran is providing two drafts to lift sanctions and nuclear obligations to European powers involved in the 2015 nuclear deal. Iran stated that the deal is within reach if the West shows good intentions.
Iran has provided European powers involved in its terrored nuclear deal with drafts on sanctions removal and nuclear commitments. Iran's top nuclear negotiator said on Thursday as world powers and Tehran try to reinstate the pact. Foreign Minister Hossein Amir Abdulhayan said on Twitter that negotiations in Austria's capital Vienna are seriously underway and that lifting sanctions is a fundamental priority. Good deal within reach if the West shows goodwill. We seek rational, sober and result-oriented dialogue. Under the pact, Tehran limited its uranium enrichment program, a potential pathway to nuclear weapons, though Iran says it seeks only civilian atomic energy in exchange for relief from the US and European Union. President Donald Trump abandoned the deal, calling it too soft on Iran, and reimposed harsh US sanctions, spurring Tehran to breach nuclear limits in the pact. Estimating that 70 to 80% of a draft agreement was completed when Iran and world powers last met in June. A senior European diplomat said on Tuesday that it remained unclear if Tehran would resume talks where they left off. A UN nuclear watchdog report stated that Tehran has begun enriching uranium with more advanced centrifuges in its Fordo plant dug into a mountain where any enrichment had been banned under the deal.
A meeting of U.S. State Secretary General and NATO top diplomats was held on Tuesday or on Wednesday in the Latvian capital Riga. The meeting aimed to discuss Russian military deployment near Ukrainian borders as the last considered military escalation. NATO issued warning to the Russian government that it will impose sanctions on Russia if the latter does not accept to pull back. Ayedi Usama.
Tensions between the neighboring countries Russia and Ukraine have escalated to an international level. After fortifying its troops on Ukraine borders, NATO issued warnings against the Russian government, obliging them to pull back. As US officials put it, Russia is likely to face harder sanctions over the last acts. Antony Blinken on a statement announced that Russia is working on destabilizing Ukraine from within.
We're deeply concerned by evidence that Russia has made plans for significant aggressive moves against Ukraine. The plans include efforts to destabilize Ukraine from within, as well as large-scale military operations. Now, we've seen this playbook before, in 2014, when Russia last invaded Ukraine.
Blinken met in Latvia on Wednesday NATO foreign ministers in bid to resolve the issue between the two countries, as they discussed what Kiev called a Russian buildup. NATO diplomatic officials pledged their support to Ukraine, as Jens Stoltenberg, NATO Secretary General, called on Russia to be more transparent and de-escalate and reduce tension in the region.
And we call on Russia to be transparent, because this is unprovoked and unexplained. So therefore, Russia needs to be transparent, and they need to reduce tensions and to de-escalate.
On the Russian behalf, Vladimir Putin announced that his country is seeking serious negotiations with the American counterpart over assigning guarantees that will limit any NATO moves towards the eastern region of Russia, as well as limiting the weapon deployment near its territories.
The U.S. military announced the upcoming deployment of U.S. troops in Africa to fight terrorism in a statement saying that more than 1,000 American National Guard troops will soon be shipped to Eastern Africa for a counter-terrorism mission intended to shore up U.S. bases spotting the region amid a series of ongoing combat and training operations. U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin is due in Seoul soon for talks with his Seoul or South Korean counterpart. Meanwhile, Austin stated that China's pursuit of hypersonic weapons increases tensions in the region. Islam Seed.
U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin stated on Thursday that China's pursuit of hypersonic weapons rises tensions in the region and promised that the U.S. is determined to prevent any potential Chinese threats. These observations came hand in hand with the annual security talks in Seoul with South Korean ally, which focused on the challenges from the neighboring countries, including China and North Korea.
We also approved new strategic planning guidance, an important step forward to frame forthcoming alliance planning efforts.
The growing military force of China, in accordance with its intention to end American supremacy in Asia, has caused worries in Washington. Experts say that the weapons system is clearly designed to evade U.S. missile defenses. However, China insisted that it was a testing reusable space vehicle, not a missile. During his visit, Austin stated that bilateral unity with South Korea would stand against any threat from the North. He added that North Korea's advancement of its missile and other weapons programs disrupting the regional security. Despite severe economic crisis caused by COVID-19, North Korea has consistently rejected U.S. offers to resume talks, claiming that Washington must first abandon its hostility toward the North. Meanwhile, the Biden administration is still maintaining the international sanctions against North Korea unless the country takes tangible steps toward nuclear demilitarization.
The United Nations Humanitarian Agency Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs appeals for a record of $41 billion to help 183 million people. The appeal is likely to fall short of its ambitions since donors provided only $17 billion, less than half of what the UN requested. Marwa Bilaiwar.
Conflicts, climate change, and the continuous rage of pandemic led the United Nations to warn that the need of humanitarian aid is skyrocketing worldwide as many people are pushed to the edge of starvation and poverty. Few hours earlier, the United Nations Humanitarian Agency Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs appealed for a record of $41 billion as aids for 183 million people worldwide who are caught up in conflicts and poverty to provide them with a life-saving assistance next year. In a global humanitarian overview report, Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs said 274 million people worldwide will need some form of emergency assistance by 2022. Donors only provided 70% from the number requested for 2021.
We aim through this program to help 183 million, the most vulnerable, again an increase from last year. And for this, we're looking for a record $41 billion for the world's humanitarian needs of the most needy in 2022.
The United Nations also said in the report that more than 24 million people require life-saving assistance in Afghanistan, which witnessed a massive increase due to the collapse of economy. Afghanistan is on top of the list of nations who are in an urgent need for funding like Syria, Yemen, Ethiopia, and Sudan. According to the United Nations humanitarian chief, Ethiopia highlighted appeal in swelling needs estimated by 26 million, including 400,000 people on the edge of starvation since Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed sent troops into the northern Tigray region, where thousands have died and millions have been displaced more than a year ago.
Ugandan army troops were seen crossing the Congolese eastern borders on Wednesday as an attempt to secure the Allied democratic bases on the Congolese side, as the Democratic Republic of Congo blessed the arrival of hundreds of Ugandan troops to its territories. The operation was considered by both countries a joint effort against one enemy. Ayedi Usama.
Allied democratic forces still represent a source of terror in the borders between Uganda and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Hundreds of Ugandan army foot soldiers were deployed inside Congolese Eastern Territory. This operation came a day after the joint artillery strikes against the Allied democratic forces. Congolese authorities announced for their part their concern about the arrival of Ugandan troops with the authorities' blessing. Hundreds of soldiers were witnessed crossing the Congolese borders as both countries deployed special forces to secure their bases. The Allied Democratic Forces are accused of several bombings in both countries that have been carried out since 2019 and killed numbers of Congolese and Ugandan civilians. The terrorist state group blamed a series of blasts on the Ugandan side, as Army spokesman Leon Richard Kasonga refused to give more information about the joint operation and the number of Ugandan troops in the Congolese territory and how long the operation will last, explaining that the operation requires patience as it has recently started. The Allied Democratic Forces, which have been uprising in Uganda since the 1990s, pledged allegiance to the terrorist state group in 2019. However, no evidence was found on the terrorist state dominance over the Allied Democratic Forces.
To Sudan now, where Secretary General of the United Nations Antonio Guterres called on the Sudanese people to overcome common sense and accept the agreement concluded by Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdok with the army to ensure a peaceful transition to real democracy in Sudan. Marwa Bilayawar.
For ensuring a peaceful transition towards a true democracy in Sudan, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, called Sudanese people to support reinstated Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdok and accept his concluded agreement with the army. Guterres' call came amid thousands of Sudanese protested near the presidential palace in Khartoum and other cities around the country to demand civilian rule since the general seized power on October 25th. Hamdok and more than 100 civilian government figures were detained. The massive protests led security forces to fire tear gas canisters in order to separate the protesters. In a news conference, the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres said that he understands the indignation and outrage of Sudanese who have seen a military coup that called into question agreements for a transition to democracy and don't want any solution involving the military. He also added that it is an important victory for the United Nations to see the Prime Minister free after his detention under military oversight. According to the United Nations Secretary General, the African Union wants to see a compromise to conclude the transition and organize the first elections in decades in Sudan.
Following weeks of economic upheaval in which inflation has surged and the currency has plunged to historic lows, Turkey's Finance Minister Lutfi Elvan has resigned and been replaced by Nordin Nebati. The currency has lost more than 40% of its value against the US dollar this year, making it the worst performing of all emerging market currencies. Erdogan accepted the resignation of Lutfi Elvan and appointed his deputy Nordin Nebati as the new finance minister. In the same context, Turkish Lira ended its fifth worst month ever, setting a new record, declining against the US dollar and the euro today by 5%. This comes after President Recep Tayyip Erdogan advocated deep cuts in interest rates despite widespread criticism and high inflation. Hossein Berkan.
The Turkish lira plunged to an all-time low of 14 against the dollar after President Recep Tayyip Erdogan repeated his defense of a new economic model based on lower interest rates despite inflation approaching 20%. Following this, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan ordered an investigation into possible currency manipulation. Turkish President stated that the lira's strict interest rate policy will not lead to a decline in inflation and promised success in what he called economical independence, and that an increase in the exchange rate will lead to higher prices and depreciation of the dollar. He explained that it will not directly affect investment, employment, and production, and stressed that he prefers a competitive exchange rate because it will lead to more investment and employment. He emphasized that Turkey has changed and will no longer surrender to external economical threats.
Eski Türkiye değildir.
Turkey has changed, and it is no longer the old Turkey, and it is no longer surrenders to the threats directed against it through the financial markets. Our economy has the ability to confront these threats, and we will stand together as a force in confronting them, as it is no longer possible to weaken us and hinder us through foreign currency speculation.
It's noteworthy that the Turkish Lira record of 13.87 against the dollar means that it has lost more than 46% of its value this year.
And finally, we wrap up our English news edition with some sports news in this report.
Egypt, a direct opponent of the Fennec in Group D, secured the crucial point by defeating Lebanon 1-0. Long sloppy in the end, the Pharaohs were granted a penalty in the 71st minute by the Ahli midfielder Mohamed Magdi Kafsha. Egypt has tied Algeria for first place in Group D, with a goal difference of +4 for Algeria to +1 for Egyptians. Morocco's win was the second largest of the day against Palestine yesterday afternoon. Winning 4-0, this meeting will have been fraught with difficulties, not least since the Moroccans were not eventually given a red. The first little surprise of the competition came during the day's last meeting. Indeed, Saudi Arabia, the region's dominant force, was defeated 1-0 by Jordan. In this physically challenging game, the referee was forced to show the red card twice, first in the 53rd minute for Jordan and once is for the 73rd for Saudi Arabia. Ad-Dawsari scored the single goal of the game in the 62nd minute of the play against his own team. Jordan has joined Morocco now at the top of the Group C.
And now it's time to have a reminder of our main top stories. Omicron spread is turning the world upside down. New lockdown measures, mandatory vaccinations, introducing new treatments, and banning flight. All of this only to contain the new variant. Iran is providing 2 drafts to lift sanctions and nuclear obligations to European powers involved in the 2015 nuclear deal. Iran stated that the deal is within reach if the West shows good intentions. A meeting of US State Secretary General and NATO top diplomats was held in the Latvian capital Riga. The meeting aimed to discuss Russian military deployments near Ukrainian borders as the last considered it military escalation. That's all for me, Nadia Kasmi, and the rest of the team. The news continues on Al 24 News. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.